Most missing person cases begin with a clear scene. A house, a road, a parking lot sealed behind police tape. Somewhere investigators can return to over and over again while trying to reconstruct what happened. But the disappearance of Lynette Hooker began on open water, and that made everything harder. According to the account surrounding this case, Lynette vanished while returning to a sailboat called Soulmate with her husband, Brian Hooker, somewhere in the Bahamas. At first, the story sounded tragic, but simple. A boating accident at night, darkness, panic. A woman lost at sea. But over time, investigators and rescuers reportedly began noticing something unsettling. The deeper they looked into the timeline, the less stable the original story allegedly became. Before we go further, I want to ask you to follow this case carefully and slowly, the same way investigators reportedly had to. Because stories like this are not solved by emotion alone. They are solved by comparing a version of events against reality itself. And according to the material connected to this disappearance, reality reportedly kept raising difficult questions. At first, everyone focused on the ocean. Search crews scanned the water. Boats moved through the darkness, searching for signs of Lynette. The assumption seemed obvious. If someone fell overboard at night, the sea itself would naturally become the center of the investigation. But according to the provided material, attention gradually began shifting somewhere else. Back toward the sailboat, Soulmate. That shift changed everything. Because once investigators reportedly began questioning whether the physical evidence fully matched the original account, every detail suddenly carried more weight. The dinghy mattered differently. The shoreline mattered differently. Witness accounts mattered differently. Even silence mattered differently. According to reports tied to the investigation, experienced sailors allegedly questioned whether the water conditions truly matched the desperate scenario described afterward. Local rescuers later raised concerns about the route Brian Hooker reportedly took after drifting ashore. Witnesses described activity near Soulmate later that same night that allegedly complicated the timeline even further. Then came reports involving the boat's electronic tracking signal, reportedly disappearing during a critical period. Individually, none of those details publicly prove a crime occurred. But together, they reportedly created a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. And perhaps the most haunting part of this case is that nearly every major question eventually led back to the same place: Soulmate. Because according to the material surrounding the investigation, the deeper people looked into what happened that night, the less this case resembled a simple accident drifting away into the ocean. Instead, it reportedly became a timeline investigators struggled to fully reconcile. And to understand why rescuers and investigators allegedly began questioning Brian Hooker's story so quickly, we first need to understand the version of events everyone was originally asked to believe. According to Brian Hooker's reported account, the night Lynette disappeared began like a normal trip back to the couple's sailboat. The two had reportedly spent time ashore before preparing to return to Soulmate, which was anchored offshore in the Bahamas. To reach the sailboat, they allegedly used a small inflatable dinghy, something common for people living aboard boats. At first, nothing about the situation sounded unusual. But according to the version of events later described publicly, something suddenly went wrong during the crossing. Brian reportedly claimed that Lynette fell backward into the water during the trip. In the confusion that followed, he allegedly lost control almost immediately. According to the account, Lynette also disappeared with several important items at the same time, including the boat keys, the emergency kill switch, and her dry bag. Brian then reportedly said he drifted helplessly through the darkness for hours while Lynette vanished into the sea. If true, it would have been terrifying. At night, the ocean changes completely. distances disappear. Orientation becomes difficult. Even experienced boaters can panic quickly in darkness, especially if someone suddenly enters the water. That is one reason many people initially accepted the story as a tragic accident. But according to the material connected to the case, experienced sailors almost immediately began focusing on details they reportedly found difficult to reconcile. And in boating communities, that matters. Because veteran mariners tend to evaluate incidents differently than casual observers online. They mentally reconstruct what allegedly happened. Water conditions, visibility, distance from shore, boat handling, human behavior under stress. And according to the provided material, that process reportedly started creating problems for the original timeline very early in the investigation. One of the first concerns involved the water itself. Early retellings of the story created the emotional impression of dangerous seas and chaotic conditions. But later reports allegedly suggested the water may actually have been relatively calm. A photograph reportedly taken around sunset appeared to show very little wave activity, leading some experienced boaters to question whether the environment fully matched the desperate scenario described afterward. Now, calm water does not mean safe water. People absolutely can drown in conditions that appear manageable, especially at night. Investigators understand that. But according to the material surrounding the case, the reportedly calmer conditions changed how some rescuers interpreted the disappearance. Because the story no longer sounded like someone vanishing into violent open ocean conditions, it reportedly became a timeline investigators needed to examine much more carefully. Then, another detail reportedly drew attention: distance. According to accounts tied to the investigation, Lynette allegedly disappeared in waters not impossibly far from shore. Some experienced sailors later questioned how a healthy adult could vanish so completely in relatively accessible waters without creating a clearer rescue sequence. Again, none of these concerns independently proved wrongdoing. But investigators reportedly were no longer dealing with just one unusual detail. They were dealing with several. And once multiple small inconsistencies begin stacking together, investigators often start asking a dangerous question. Does this story rely on too many coincidences happening at the exact same moment? Because according to Brian's reported version of events, Lynette did not simply fall into the water. She allegedly disappeared while also taking with her the boat keys, the emergency shutoff system, and personal belongings, all during one sudden moment of chaos. To some observers, that sounded like terrible luck. To others, it reportedly sounded increasingly difficult to reconstruct cleanly. But according to the material surrounding the investigation, the biggest problem for the timeline was still coming. Because rescuers soon reportedly began questioning Brian Hooker's movements after he allegedly reached shore. According to the material surrounding the investigation, one of the first major cracks in Brian Hooker's story reportedly appeared after rescuers examined the route he claimed to have taken once he reached shore. Brian allegedly said that after drifting through the night, he finally washed ashore near Marsh Harbor around 4 in the morning. According to the account, he then attempted to find help by knocking on doors and trying to stop a passing vehicle. On paper, that sounds believable. An exhausted survivor reaching land in darkness would naturally search for assistance as quickly as possible. But according to local rescuers familiar with the area, parts of the story allegedly made very little sense geographically. And that distinction became important. Because investigators do not only compare stories against emotions, they compare them against terrain, distance, visibility, and human behavior under stress. According to reports connected to the case, rescuers described the shoreline area as rough, dark, and difficult to cross at night. Thick brush, jagged rocks, uneven terrain. conditions that would reportedly have been physically exhausting for anyone stumbling through darkness after hours in the water. Yet according to those same accounts, there was reportedly a brightly lit boatyard nearby. That detail immediately drew attention, because rescuers allegedly struggled to understand why someone desperate for help would move away from visible lights and toward rough terrain instead. According to one interpretation of the reports, the route Brian described sounded almost backwards compared to what most survivors would naturally do under stress. And then, another detail reportedly raised even more concern. Brian allegedly claimed that the rocks along the shoreline badly damaged his feet during the journey. But according to rescuers, when they eventually found him, he was still reportedly wearing slide sandals. To some people, that sounded minor. To others, it became one more inconsistency attached to an already unstable timeline. Then, investigators reportedly encountered another problem. According to Brian's account, he allegedly knocked on only a small number of doors before eventually heading back toward the marina area. But reports connected to the investigation suggested that no confirmed homeowners publicly came forward saying Brian Hooker had knocked on their door that night. Again, none of those details independently prove anything. That is important to repeat. A confusing route is not proof of murder. Human behavior during panic can become irrational. Exhausted people make strange decisions. Trauma affects memory and judgment. But according to the material surrounding the case, rescuers reportedly were no longer dealing with isolated inconsistencies. They were dealing with a growing pattern of details that allegedly stopped fitting together naturally. And then the timeline reportedly became even harder to explain. Because while investigators and volunteers focused on the shoreline questions, witnesses near Soulmate allegedly described something unexpected happening later that same night. A large splash near the sailboat itself. And according to the material connected to the investigation, that single detail may have changed the direction of the entire case. According to the material connected to the investigation, the case took a dramatic turn when witness accounts reportedly began conflicting with the original timeline. Until then, most people still believed the critical event happened somewhere between shore and the sailboat. The ocean itself remained the assumed center of the disappearance. But then witnesses reportedly described activity near Soulmate later that same night. And that changed everything. One of the most important reports involved a sound allegedly heard near the sailboat, hours after Brian Hooker claimed Lynette had already disappeared. According to the provided material, a witness reportedly described hearing a large splash close to Soulmate much later into the night. That timing became extremely important. Because if the original account was completely accurate, there should not have been major activity near the sailboat at that point. According to the timeline initially described, the emergency had already happened earlier during the dinghy crossing. So investigators reportedly began asking a difficult question. What caused the splash? Now, it is important to stay careful here. A sound in the water does not automatically indicate criminal activity. Boats shift, equipment moves. Sound travels strangely at night over open water. Witnesses can also misjudge timing or distance. But according to the material surrounding the case, the reported timing allegedly created serious pressure on the original narrative. And then another witness account reportedly raised even more concern. According to the provided material, someone allegedly saw a flare moving horizontally across the water instead of vertically into the sky. At first glance, that detail may not sound important. But for experienced mariners, the distinction reportedly stood out immediately. Traditional distress flares are generally launched upward so they can be seen across long distances. A flare traveling horizontally across dark water creates a very different impression. According to observers following the case, that report became one more detail suggesting the activity near Soulmate may not have unfolded the way the public originally understood. Again, none of this independently proves what happened to Lynette Hooker. But according to the material connected to the investigation, this was the stage where the case reportedly stopped looking like a simple accident timeline. Because investigators were no longer focused only on where Lynette disappeared. They were reportedly trying to determine when key events actually happened. And that distinction changed the entire investigation. If Lynette truly vanished during the original dinghy trip, then later activity near the sailboat might be unrelated coincidence. But if the timeline shifted even slightly, entirely different possibilities entered the case. And once those possibilities existed, every detail connected to Soulmate suddenly mattered more. The witness accounts mattered more. The reported movements aboard the vessel mattered more. Even the boat's electronic systems reportedly became critical to investigators. Because according to the material surrounding the case, sometime during that same night, Soulmate allegedly went electronically silent. Its AIS tracking signal reportedly disappeared during the exact period investigators were struggling to reconstruct. And for many people following the investigation, that was the moment this case became much harder to dismiss as a straightforward boating accident. According to the material connected to the investigation, one of the most unsettling developments in the Lynette Hooker case involved something investigators reportedly could not physically see: a missing signal. The sailboat Soulmate's AIS tracking system allegedly stopped transmitting during the same critical period investigators were already struggling to reconstruct. For many people following the case online, that detail immediately sounded suspicious. But before jumping to conclusions, it is important to understand why authorities reportedly focused on it so heavily. AIS stands for Automatic Identification System. In simple terms, it allows vessels to electronically broadcast identifying and location information. Boats equipped with AIS can often be tracked through marine navigation systems, helping nearby vessels and monitoring stations know where they are positioned. According to the provided material, Soulmate's AIS signal reportedly disappeared around 9:29 that night, before allegedly returning the next morning. That timing immediately raised questions. Now, an AIS interruption alone does not prove criminal activity. Electronics can fail. Systems can lose power. Signals can temporarily disappear for innocent reasons. Investigators would need much more than one missing transmission window to prove wrongdoing. But according to the material surrounding the case, context is what made the issue difficult to ignore. Because by this point, investigators reportedly were already dealing with conflicting witness accounts, shoreline contradictions, and a timeline that allegedly no longer fit together cleanly. And then, another detail reportedly deepened concern even further. According to reports tied to the investigation, after Brian Hooker was allegedly recovered from shore the following morning, he reportedly spent time below deck aboard Soulmate before the vessel was fully secured. That moment became extremely important to people following the case. Because if evidence existed aboard the sailboat, the timeline surrounding access to the boat suddenly mattered a great deal. Electronics, navigation systems, communication devices, storage areas. All of it potentially became part of the investigation. Again, none of this publicly proves evidence was altered or destroyed. But according to the material connected to the case, investigators reportedly began treating Soulmate less like the location of an accident and more like a possible forensic scene. That perception intensified when authorities allegedly surrounded the vessel with crime scene tape and removed multiple electronic devices from on board. Reports connected to the investigation described computers, tablets, and boat systems reportedly being taken for analysis. Observers also pointed out that modern vessels can preserve operational data capable of helping investigators reconstruct movement, timing, and activity during critical windows of time. And that possibility changed the emotional direction of the entire case. Because machines do not care about stories. They record activity, movement, interruptions, timing. Sometimes digital systems cannot explain why something happened. But according to investigators in many modern cases, electronic records can still challenge whether a timeline fully makes sense. And according to the material surrounding the Soulmate investigation, authorities reportedly were no longer examining only what happened on the water that night. They also began looking at Lynette Hooker's life before she disappeared. Because people close to her allegedly revealed details that made the case even more emotionally disturbing. Even now, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker remains trapped between two very different possibilities. One version of the story describes a tragic accident at sea. Darkness, panic, confusion. A woman falling into the water during a nighttime return to an anchored sailboat. The other possibility is far more unsettling. That somewhere inside the timeline of that night, the original story reportedly stopped matching the evidence surrounding it. And according to the material connected to the investigation, that is what kept pulling investigators back towards Soulmate. Not one dramatic clue, not one single piece of evidence, but accumulation. The reportedly calm water conditions, the shoreline route rescuers allegedly struggled to believe, the witness who reportedly heard a splash near the sailboat later that night, the flare allegedly moving horizontally across the water, the AIS tracking signal reportedly disappearing during a critical period, and the electronic devices authorities allegedly removed from the vessel afterward. Individually, none of those details publicly prove what happened to Lynette Hooker. But together, they reportedly created enough uncertainty that investigators could no longer treat the case as a straightforward boating accident. And maybe that is why this story continues haunting so many people. Because the deeper the investigation reportedly went, the less stable the original timeline allegedly became. Yet despite all the theories surrounding Soulmate, one reality still stands above everything else. Lynette Hooker has never been publicly found. No confirmed public forensic conclusion. No definitive reconstruction released publicly. No final answer. Only unanswered questions surrounding a woman who disappeared without explanation somewhere in the Bahamas. And that is important to remember, because true crime should never become just entertainment built around suspicion. Responsible investigations require patience. They require evidence. They require the willingness to separate what is publicly known from what people merely believe may have happened. Right now, according to the material surrounding this case, there are still major unknowns. Maybe investigators already know more than the public realizes. Maybe electronic evidence from Soulmate preserved important details from that night. Maybe witness statements shifted the investigation in ways that have never been fully disclosed publicly. Or maybe the final truth still has not fully surfaced at all. But somewhere inside those missing hours, there is almost certainly a real sequence of events that explains what happened to Lynette Hooker. And until clearer answers emerge, this case will likely remain one of those rare disappearances where the silence surrounding the timeline feels almost as unsettling as the disappearance itself. If you followed this case with me, I want to know which detail changed your perspective the most. The shoreline route, the splash near Soulmate, the AIS signal, or the witness timeline itself. And if you discuss this case, Do it carefully and respectfully, because behind every theory is still a missing woman, a family waiting for answers, and a truth investigators reportedly continue trying to reconstruct, piece by piece.